For those who missed the first session, I'm Tina Zakowski. I'm the administration team leader at the Canadian Angus Association. I'm stalling as much as I can to let them filter into the room. Don't tell anyone. And joining us today, we have Fawn Jackson with Canadian Cattlemen's Association, Brian Walton, who's recently retired from the National and Alberta Cattle Feeders, and Jeff Fitzpatrick Stillwell from McDonald's Canada. And I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves and talk a little bit about who they are, what they do, and their, based on their backgrounds and impressions, their take on national and international demand for Canadian beef.
So I'm just going to start. Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning. I see it's hard to compete with the EPD guys, but glad you guys are here to talk about the demand for beef. And so I'm Fawn Jackson, and I do international trade and government relations for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, and have recently moved into our Ottawa office out there. So I'm going to start talking about some pretty exciting things that have been happening in the trade world. So although it may not look like it, this is a very, very exciting slide. And that's because we have in Canada had really quite great success in putting a number of building blocks in place for trade. So when we look at the last number of years, if we look at, it started with Korea in 2014. So our tariff rate into Korea right now is currently 26.7%, and that's going to be going down to 0. And we've certainly seen growth in the Korean market. Then when we look into September of 2017, that's when we signed the Canada-European trade agreement, the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, and we have seen really significant growth into Europe as well. Europe tends to be a smaller market for us, but last year we certainly saw some significant growth in that market as well. In December of 2018, and 2018 December is important because that meant that in January 1st, 2019, we could get a second tariff cut. With CPTPP, our crown jewel there is Japan, and so we went from a 38.5 tariff rate in Japan, and now we're currently at a 26.6%. Another interesting one under the CPTPP agreement is Vietnam, where we went from a 20% tariff down to a 6.6, and next year we're going to be moving into a 0. So this is all very exciting because trade has gone up both in value as well as in volume, but the value has certainly increased more than the volume has. So I think really speaks to the quality product that Canada has. So here's just a second slide to sort of look at how volume has been growing, but then also how value has been growing as well. So, overall, I would say pretty exciting times in terms of market access for the Canadian beef industry. And so what are the next steps? So, we really focused since the BSE years in terms of recovering our market access in terms of the big building blocks, but now we have some fine tuning that needs to be done. And one of those things that was completed recently was that Japan reviewed their OTM access into that market. So it was a ruling that applied to Canada, Ireland, United States. So now not only do we have that reduced tariff rate into Japan, but we also can sell OTM cattle or beef into Japan as well. What will that look like in terms of scale? I think we're waiting to see how that product is going to do in the Japanese market, but certainly having the opportunity to do that is something that we're always aiming towards. In terms of other fine-tuning, there's a number of other markets around the world. So Korea is one where we would like to get OTM access. Taiwan is one as well. We have some regulatory cooperation that we want to be working with the US on. With Europe, we have some protocols that we would like to get approved so that we can ship more product into that market as well. So I would say that the last number of years were about putting big building blocks in place, and now what we're going to be doing is working on those finer details. Although, we certainly have those building blocks in place and we have the resources in place to be working on those finer details, questions will always remain in the international market and about in terms of, where things are going to be going in the future. And so, one of the discussions right now has certainly been China, and whether that's on the Siemens side, I'm sure that many of you saw that change there, or whether that's them ramping up their inspection as well. So China will remain as one of our biggest markets for opportunity, but also one of our biggest markets for questions as to where that's going to be headed in the future. In terms of what we would like to see advance with China, currently we have a 12% tariff rate into the Chinese market, and so we would like to, for Canada and China to work on the previous progress that we've made in terms of relations on agriculture to reduce that tariff rate, and we would also like to see system-wide approval so that all of our packing plants are able to ship into the Chinese market. Obviously, right now, discussions with China aren't the easiest conversation to be having, but there's a number of international factors that I think are also playing into our favor. So China right now, of course, has been dealing very much so with African swine fever. They're going to have an enormous potential in terms of people exporting into the Chinese market, because the damage that has done to their internal supply is really almost incomprehensible. It's really, really giant. Brazil just had an atypical case of BSE, so that's one of the main markets that ships into China, and so they have a temporary ban shipping into China right now as well. And then India is a pretty fascinating country. They ship a lot of water buffalo meat into the Chinese market, and their government has not been supportive of meat production really at all. I was just visiting last week with one of the biggest processors there, and they're doing things like making it impossible to have discharge from their packing plants. They've put a huge ban on leather manufacturing in India, and this has to do with cultural beliefs that are tied into their political system right now. So I think questions as to where China is going to go are certainly not only a Huawei Canada discussion with the US, but certainly plays into a larger global economic situation. Another conversation I think that we've all been watching very, very closely is what's going to happen with USMCA, or CUSMA is what we call it here in Canada. And so it seems to be a bit of a two-step. We're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So just recently we had the 232 tariffs repealed in the US, and so those were tariffs that the US was putting on steel and aluminum that applied both to Mexico and Canada, as well as other countries around the world. And it made it a very difficult situation in which to move forward with ratification. And so Canada and Mexico both pushed back and said, we're not moving forward with ratification until those tariffs were removed. So those tariffs did get removed. There was an introduction of draft texts in the US Congress. And then on Friday, President Trump made a tweet about putting tariffs back onto Mexico to do with illegal immigration. And so, it would be hard to see that Mexico would like to move forward with further ratification with those types of tariffs in place. So we're going to see right away on Monday that's supposed to be coming into place, starting at 5% a broadband tariff application and moving up to 25%. I was just reading the news, and Mexico is certainly putting some different things in place to try and negotiate and make sure that USMCA and North American trade can continue. It's certainly, for us in the Canadian beef industry, we've communicated as to whether the old NAFTA stays in place or whether the new NAFTA stays in place. We're happy with both. What we would not be happy with is if there was a withdrawal out of NAFTA and that we were left with uncertainty as to what beef trade between Canada, the US, and Mexico would look like going forward. So we continue to talk about the importance of that market. So I suppose in summary, there's many positive developments right now in terms of trade access for Canadian beef around the world, and whether that's looking at the growth that we've seen in China or the growth that we've seen in Europe or into Japan. But questions will always remain, and that's why it's so important that we work in making sure that we have a diverse market access. So with that, I will hand it over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Fawn. Yeah, well, my name is Brian Walton. I'm not going to give my bio. It's in the book, but I did retire in January, and when the word goes out that you're a free man on the land, the invitations come, and I happened to be doing some market research in Maui at the time. And I did find Canadian beef there, by the way, but I was pleased to get the invitation because it gave me an opportunity to read a bit more and just to talk to my packer friends and my cattle feeder family, and some people are in the marketing business. And I went right actually to Canada Beef, and I'd like to acknowledge Canada Beef for their contribution to this presentation. I was a little surprised that they didn't get the nod, but I know that they were in between CEOs. So what I'm going to do is present to you some research they did in the 4 markets where they have their offices. And this is the company, Euromonitor International, that did the work for them. And therefore, the 4 markets we're looking at, and this is an online consumer survey that was done on those 4 their markets in Asia and then Mexico. The survey was done, as I said, online. They took the top 20 percentile, so those that have a higher income, anticipating that would be the demographic, I guess, that would be more likely to purchase or be in a position to purchase Canadian beef. And you can see the cities there where they did the interviews. Mexico City, the Mayan Riviera, and then Monterrey. And then in China, they looked at Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou. Guangzhou is the 3rd largest city in China on the Pearl River, just northwest of Hong Kong. It was once known as Canton. And then Taiwan, they just went to Taipei, and in Japan, Osaka and Tokyo. And I'm going to give you 2 slides for each country. One is basically about quality, their impressions of quality. And these are intentions. This isn't absolute empirical numbers in terms of what I buy, but what I think and what I view as in terms of awareness. So the first one here is Japan. And you can see they're real homers. They love their Wagyu. They're quite Japan-centric, of course. And the rest of the countries that are shipping in there like pale by comparison when it comes to views about quality. But as Fawn's alluded to with the CPP, TPP, Japan has become an even more important market. And the exports have, I believe, they've tripled in the first quarter of this year over last year. Then when the question was asked about awareness, about 44% gave us, somewhat familiar, moderately, and extremely familiar. So, it's better to be on that end than lower on. But still, there's quite a bit of opportunity there in terms of awareness. If we go to the next market, this is China. And China, this is actually a very nice slide to put up. When you look at which country has the highest quality of beef, look at where Canada comes in. And then followed by countries like New Zealand, Japan, and Australia. So that is a very positive slide. And an outcome from the consumers in those 3 cities that were surveyed. Familiarity, again, this is interesting because we don't have a large presence in China, and a lot of the beef that's gone into China has gone through the gray market where it sometimes loses its identity. But when you look at how familiar you are with Canadian beef, it's a pretty strong, moderately to extremely familiar, so that's basically 52% of those surveyed. Again, I think a positive story. Taiwan is, again, a little different, but you know, I guess their proximity to Japan puts Japan at the highest level in their opinions in terms of quality, but look at who comes second. It's Canada, followed by Australia. I think that's positive, very positive. So if you look at then awareness, maybe not quite as much awareness, and you know, Taiwan doesn't take a lot of Canadian beef, but there are hopes that market will improve. Now this one is really interesting. God love those Mexicans. You know, when asked, I mean, Canada triples the view of their quality of their own product. So for us, you know, I think the Canadian presence, and if you look at where those surveys were done, you know, there's probably you know, obviously a pretty good presence of Canadian beef there, and I mean, Mexico used to be after U.S. our third most important market, our second most important market. So about awareness, and these are very strong numbers. So yeah, we know about Canadian beef. We think highly of it in terms of quality. So you know, those are all good results the way I see it. Now this report did a deeper dive on demographics and different age groups, but I didn't have time to get into that. So where is our beef going? Fawn alluded to this a little bit, but obviously, you know, the U.S. continues to be a big market for us. But Japan is rising, and in fact, that percentage there is probably going to bump up this year. China, I don't know if China is going to improve much. We have a chilled pilot that I still don't think is off the ground, so basically it's frozen, bone-in, and boneless. Mexico, I guess as much of Mexico is going to go by demographic and how their economy and how the middle class is strengthening. But I guess the last bullet here is the beef exports are up by 22% over 2019, you know, over 18, which is, in my opinion, very, very, very positive. So our biggest customer and our biggest competitor. So this is U.S. beef exports and where they go. Does this look familiar? Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Canada, Hong Kong, and China. Well, they call it Taiwan in the slide. I got these slides from the Northern American Meat Institute presentations that were done in April. So, and where does the U.S. import their beef from? Again, our biggest customer, biggest competitor from Canada, Australia, and you can see the bump in exports for Canada, which is a positive sign. But I guess my concluding comment would be, we may not be the biggest in every market. We will not be in every market. What can we do to capture the category that gives us the biggest premium, views Canadian beef as a high-quality product, and take advantage of that? What's the narrative? Because we're competing with, you know, grain-finished beef from other places, but that's a real opportunity, and I guess that's it for me. Jeffrey, you're up next. You can go through the drive-thru if you want. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. Well, it was a bit of an interesting thing for the sustainability guy to be asked if he wanted to be on a panel about domestic and international perceptions. So I was like, can Fawn just do my presentation for me too? So since it is not my area of expertise, I thought what I would maybe talk about is from the McDonald's perspective, because that's what I know, and I have colleagues who do the same thing as me and work on beef sustainability all over the world, kind of what our discussions are about and what we're talking about. So foundationally, we have a global goals around beef sustainability, and some of those you can probably read. Some of it's a bit of an eye chart, but they're really about just strengthening our commitment to those industries and the areas that we source beef from, about being an additional support, about building all that positive work in. In the previous panel, I talked a lot about trust, and that's what we're working on, is to continue to build trust. And we have a really great story in Canada to tell, obviously. And we're doing really good stuff on different beef sustainability actions all over the world. So I just pulled up a few examples of places from either the US and Brazil and in Europe where we're doing lots of really interesting things. And that's a really great thing for me, is I get to learn from colleagues what's important in other areas when they're thinking about beef and they're thinking about quality and trust in those aspects, and where some of those investments McDonald's can make there. And then I get to share, of course, from the Canadian perspective, what's important to Canadians and what we're working on. And the really big takeaway for that is that the work that we're doing in Canada, and I've had the real privilege over the last 6 years to really be sharing on a constant basis all the work that's been going on here, building the round table and all of that fantastic story. And I'd say for the first few years, my colleagues were kind of interested, and just as I was with what they're doing, but it was they were kind of focused on what they're doing. In the last couple of years, specifically because we have launched the ability to use the CRSB's certification logo on our Angus burgers, the level of inquiry is at a fever pitch, I would say, and we had a global supply chain sustainability team meeting in Chicago a few weeks ago, and it was my 5 minutes of being able to talk then turned into 45 minutes of questions from all these people about what we're doing. And the real thing I took away from that is all of the other markets around the world are looking to Canada, not only on they want to know how did you build that certification program when they're talking to their industries and the whole value chain in those other countries. There's nothing like the alignment that we have in Canada, all the way from producers right the way through to retailers. I sometimes forget, because I've been privileged again to be so in-depth in it here, that it's not like that in other countries, and there's a lot more separation, and they don't talk to each other in the same way. So they just, at this point, on the certification, the sourcing side, they just can't sort of fathom how we brought all that together and how it was able to happen here and how everybody agreed to be part of that. But now that we've done this massive amount of consumer engagement, they're also so inquisitive about how we've been able to do it. One, how we've been able to get senior management to want to put that kind of money behind this kind of effort. But then two, how we designed it, how we're connecting to Canadians. So we were asked to sort of talk about best practice stuff. And for me, it's really proud moment for me to be able to talk to those people about Canada, because they're all looking to Canada as the example now, both on the sourcing and how you do that and bring the value chain together, but also now in delivering and how you engage customers on that. So it's a really good moment, and a huge thank you to all the Canadian producers who enable us to be able to do this, and know that is ringing true. And we have a new head of our supply chain company for our company in China. And she was there, and she made sure she sat beside me at the thing, and the whole time she was just peppering me with questions and wanting to know more and more again about how we did this there, because they really see that as a value, and they see what the Canadian brand is internationally is really impressive. This was just a bit of, this is what I used to show them how we executed that beef sustainability campaign that hopefully most of you in the room saw, and it was really across everything, in cinema, it's in the restaurants, on TV, social, and the mailers that go to every household in Canada, all of that stuff. So again, a huge effort behind it, and something that other markets are looking to, and it's just shining the Canadian beef brand halo. When I'm looking forward and what's the future, and one of the questions too was what's the future for Canadian beef? I think we have a real opportunity, and it was so interesting to see from the previous presentations some of those numbers and who's already thinking the Canadian beef brand is good. And we just have such an opportunity to shine that even more. And I think that will be done largely through trust, right? That's some of the stuff, again, that my colleague from China was asking a lot about is, how do Canadians feel? Are they trusting? Is the logo something that they are feeling trust in? And of course, it's early days for that. And as I said in the previous panel, I'm really excited for other retailers to be able to get that supply and come on and start using it too, so that we can really get some more definitive data about what Canadians feel about that. But that ability to have Canadians feel great about the sustainability story of Canadian beef is only going to help drive that external perception of the quality and the positive aspect of Canadian beef. So that's really where I see that that growing and that opportunity, again, based on my discussions with my international colleagues. So a huge, again, thank you to Canadian producers for doing all of the amazing work that you do that's enabling all of us to talk about it, not only nationally, but internationally as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights and your thoughts. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to open it up. Are there any questions from, or actually before we open it up to the floor, do you have any questions for each other? Jeff has a question.
Because, and I think most of you know, Fawn's, before her previous job, was leading the Canadian beef sustainability efforts nationally. So in your new role, as you've been engaging with international audiences, is that something in the way that it is internally for McDonald's that's been coming up for me? Are you getting questions about that, or are you having an opportunity to talk about that with international delegations?
Yeah, I think Canada's definitely made their mark on the map in terms of sustainability, and I think everybody knows that consumers want to know more about where their food comes from, and so how do you create channels to be able to do that is something which Canada has completed, and we talk about it both from the people who are purchasing beef, but also from our other partners around the world, for example, at the International Beef Alliance, so where we sit with Paraguay, Brazil, New Zealand, Australia, US, and so it's definitely been a conversation on many fronts.
Brian, you look like you wanted to ask a question. No? You're good? Okay. Do we have any questions from the floor? We have one right here. And it is a little hard to hear in here, so what we're going to do is make sure that everybody speaks into the microphone so we know the question and then we hear the answer.
Thanks. I guess a comment first. I wanted to just say to Jeff, thank you for what you and McDonald's are doing. And I commend you for coming out to ranches. Like, I'm friends with Aaron and Adrian, and I saw the pictures. I invite you to our ranch any day. We're having brandings are coming up, so come on out. But thank you for coming out and understanding what's going on and the work that you're doing with us and for us. I guess my question would be to Fawn or Brian. I was kind of the last shift of Canadian Beef Export Federation before it became Canada Beef. And any of my interactions with the Chinese were really good. It was lots of fun. I learned so much. Can you kind of put a number or a bullseye if we have trouble with China coming up? Is it going to impact us? It's no secret that this spring we sold cattle. It held steady for us really well with the new trade agreements we have. If China starts to give us some trouble, is there someone who can pick up the slack, or will it impact our prices going forward?
Who wants to tackle that one first?
I don't think we've seen the end of our problems with China. I know people that are doing business there, that were doing business and have businesses there that won't go there anymore. They meet their partners in Spain or somewhere else, so there's a real concern there. As far as I know, that chilled pilot is not off the ground, Fawn. It's a year ago it was announced, or thereabouts. But that really brings into focus the value of CPTPP, and Japan is the jewel in the crown, and to see the lift we're getting in terms of exports to Japan. But don't forget about, there is a correlation with developing countries as they grow, as their economies strengthen, as people have more money in their pockets, as the middle class expands, there's more likelihood that you're going to have customers for your product. So, if at some point Korea comes knocking on the door, wants to join CPP, TPP, then that disadvantage we have with the Americans on the tariff reduction is disappears. And Korea was our fourth most important market before BSC hit. So those are the countries I'd be thinking about. I mean, Vietnam's 89 million people. It's an emerging, it's a growing economy, and those are the things we need to be thinking about.
Definitely echo what Brian says. China is certainly a complicated case, and it seems to be getting more complicated going forward. But I think that there are some things happening in the world stage. So right now, U.S. and China and the tariffs that are being put in place are, I suppose, driving some of the growth that Canada has seen into the Chinese market over the last year, which has been quadruple, essentially. So there's a lot of different factors in place. African swine fever, what's happening with Brazil right now, what's happening with India right now, the amount of meat that they need in China. So I think somebody is going to be supplying that. So I think what's really important for the Canadian beef industry is that we have as many different pockets of market access as possible, as you would know from your days on previous boards. And so I think that we're going to continue to work on that, and we're going to continue to work in making sure that there are tools in place, such as the World Trade Organization, so that we can have these that sort of backstop to making sure that international trade continues in a manner that's predictable. But that all being said, it's a complicated situation right now that is unfortunately having some pretty significant impacts for farmers all around the world in those discussions. So good question.
Yes, I have to compliment you three for the work you're doing for us people, grassroots, trying to supply the product that we're proud of raising. One question, we talk about the supply chain and keeping it moving. What's going to be the weakest link that's going to slow us down? Because the momentum is building with all the, like McDonald's, you got to thank them for what they've done. They've stepped above and beyond anybody else in the industry to help us out. Can we keep this machine going?
For those of you who have seen the video that Jeff referred to earlier, that's Duncan Fleming, who is one of the families featured in that video.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start because I think you guys are probably better versed to answer it. But I would say, again, just to reinforce what I see when I talk to my global colleagues about how special Canada is with how the supply chain here works together and supports each other. So I think I feel very optimistic about everything keep moving. I mean, from the sustainability side, of course, we can, the supply can't grow fast enough for us. And, leadership always wants to know when can it be 100% of everything that we source. So that's going to come. But I think the opportunity we have here is absolutely unique from all the major beef producing nations. So I feel really optimistic that we'll be able to keep everything going. And I think importantly, as more retailers are able to use the logo and do that, because we talked about, and Janice in the previous panel talked about telling your story. And one thing that I always want to be conscious of is that what we really want producers to be focused on is doing what you do best, which is producing the safest, highest quality, and most sustainable beef in the world. And that's what we want you to do. Asking you to also be the storytellers for everything too, I think is great when you have that opportunity. But I think for those of us, McDonald's Canada has 3 million Canadians through our doors every single day. That storytelling stuff needs to be on us, right? We have that direct connection. We have the resources to do that. So it's a sort of our way of thanking you and giving back to you for all of that amazing work that you do that lets us source such a high quality, safe, sustainable product and be able to talk to consumers about it, we have an onus to tell your story. And I appreciate the comments about going to the ranches. There's literally nothing I like better than being able to be boots on the ground at an operation, because I just learned so much. But it enables me to understand the real value of us understanding the authentic story and then being able to tell it. So I would say just, keep being you guys, keep doing everything you do, and us, and then I know other Canadian retailers too are eager to be able to help tell that story, and that comes when that supply can grow a bit more for us. They'll be able to be on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, the question becomes, what's our ability to supply growing markets? We're going to always face some challenges. Europe is a frustrating place because it was one of the first big bilaterals. And these side letters in terms of carcass washes have been a real irritation. This is all about food safety in our eyes. The issue about implants and antibiotics, you can debate that. But I think we have to recognize that. I think Canadian producers, the ingenuity of Canadian producers, their flexibility, and I would say a strong regulatory backdrop. I was invited to go to the OIE meetings last year by Canada's chief vet, and to see those guys in action and how important it is for them to keep the connections they have all over the world with their colleagues. It's probably underplayed and you don't see enough of it, but they work hard to do that, and we're lucky we have them. The only other thing I would say is, and I don't want to sound like alarmist, but I don't know that we're paying enough attention to prevent the incursion of a foreign animal disease. And why I say that is I was invited last year when I still had a paying job. Janice now sits at my desk, but anyway. Public Safety Canada organized a by invitation only meeting. It was in Calgary, about 90 of us. There's only 2 from agriculture. And in the morning presentation, there's a lot of focus on cybersecurity and whatnot. But they put up the UK's top 3 concerns, what they think are their top 3 risks. Pandemic was still number 1. I can't remember the second one. I think it was a collapse of their financial system. But the third was the incursion of a foreign animal disease. So in the afternoon, I asked, they had a panel of all the spooks, the CFI guys and the CSIS people and the RCMP. And I asked the question, look at the UK, what is Canada doing to prevent the incursion of a foreign animal disease? I mean, African swine fever, they've just decided to beef up their dog force, but they're not even trained yet. If you look at foot and mouth, and I was just with the vice president of Maple Leaf Foods on Monday, and in a meeting last year at Maple Leaf's headquarters, Michael McCain says that is his biggest worry for his brand, for his customers, is a foot and mouth outbreak here. And I don't know that we're in a position to respond to that adequately. And we have been pushing that, and Rory and I from Maple Leaf worked quite a bit on that to try and get something that would put us in a better position to respond more quickly, because there are some estimates that could have an impact upwards of $59 billion to our, considering ripple effects. So, I mean, that could happen. I'm not saying it's tomorrow. The experts say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So, I don't know, Fawn, if you have anything to add to that.
I think those are great comments on the Europe front. Maybe I'll just add in there in terms of supply. So for Europe, you have to have an audit that you're growth enhancement free, that those animals haven't had those products on it. And it's a bit of a catch-22 in terms of making sure there's supply, and then that somebody is wanting to ship it over into Europe. But certainly, we have 50,000 tons of access into Europe, and we're not using our full potential there as of yet. So I think that that is going to be a hindrance to make sure that we have, right now, it has to be a veterinarian who does the audit on the operation. Well, we don't have enough veterinarians to do those audits across Canada. We don't have enough protocols in place to be able to access that market to its full potential. So I think that there's some fundamentals there that need to be taken care of before we can ensure that our supply going forward is going to be enough. And then in terms of regulations, I think, is another thing in Canada that is limiting growth of the Canadian beef industry, because certainly the export markets are signaling that they want enough Canadian beef and that we should be in a position to supply that. So why haven't we seen more growth of the Canadian beef herd? I think is a good question, and making sure that we have some of the fundamentals in terms of business risk management tools in place, that regulations aren't getting in the place of our producers being competitive around the world. So I think those are some of the things that we're going to need to make sure that we're taking care of going forward. Labor is a really, really big conversation right now that I would say is our biggest trade limiting factor in Canada. And so how do we make sure that those things are taken care of? And I would also say that those are Canadian things that we can control and that we can fix here in Canada. There's a number of different factors around the world that we, although we participate in many dialogues around the world to help guide those conversations, these are things that we can actually take care of in Canada and that we control, and that I think is going to be absolutely fundamental for the next government coming into place to make sure that we can grow to our full potential here in Canada with Canadian agriculture exports.
Okay, I would actually like to ask a question. Brian, you talked about the threat of disease, that huge risk and the potential financial impact. What should we be doing as producers so that we're as prepared as we can? Obviously, we can't control all of it, but what can we be doing? Industry needs to do what industry does, but what can we be doing as individual producers to help and try and mitigate that risk? And not just Brian specifically.
I'm a big risk. I go back to prevent it in the first place, and make sure that the agriculture voice is heard in that milieu that looks at other risks. There's a lot of concerns about Huawei, and the reason behind that is if they get embedded in building infrastructure projects that potentially we could be at risk. The fact that two of us were invited to that, only two agriculture people were invited to that session by Public Safety Canada suggests to me that we need to be more visible. We're kind of going on the system. Were you on a farm in the last 2 weeks when you're coming back to the country? Check it. Do you even get pulled over? Or how do we know that those people that have been on a farm in Brazil or wherever come here and they could potentially bring foot and mouth into the country? What are you doing about that? So that's a good offense is a good defense. And I guess I got frustrated because we could see the need to be better prepared for the foot and mouth, and everybody says that's the big one. But it also provokes a conversation around once you have it, if you have it, when you get it, if you have it, what's our vaccine policy? Do we have enough vaccines? The Americans are boosting their vaccine bank, and it's actually an antigen bank. And we were in Lyon last year to look at where the vaccines are produced by Boehringer Ingelheim, and there was and they're just stored in semen tanks, and they have 5-year durability. And those vaccines can be ramped up, and there is a shared vaccine bank that can be used and even shipped to different parts of the world. But I don't know that we even have enough for our own needs. And you all know that if you get foot and mouth, the borders close. And the thinking is they'll close for 18 months. So I think there has to be a deeper dive on that, on the strategy about our readiness. If we get it, how, and the other thing is mass depopulation. There's still this thinking that we're going to start depopulating the way it was done in the old days. I don't think that's a solution anymore. Besides which, if you have a 15,000 head feedlot, it would take you 75 days to depopulate. And who's going to do it? The farmer's not going to go out and shoot the animals. They have to have a mechanism to deal with that, or you vaccinate. And then do you vaccinate to kill or to live? That's another question.
I'd like to thank Brian for mentioning all that, and it is something that we all should be aware of, because biosecurity on our own place, or all our places, should be very important, whether you're going to your neighbors to brand his calves, going to maybe to your bull customers and walking into his yard to try and sell a bull to him, and And he just mentioned, yeah, we got a real outbreak of scours or cocci on our place, and then you go home and don't change your boots or your apparel. It's something that we all have to be conscious of, because we've had some tours years ago at our place coming over from Europe, and the first place they come to was our place, and they're totally shocked when they get off the bus that we asked them to go through a dip. And I think it's important that CFIA should be, like Brian said, due diligence. If you're around the world and you've been on a farm in the last 2 weeks, and like you said, they just brush you through. I think it's a real problem that we have to address, and I think all of us should be aware of it.
Did you want to respond, Brian? If you didn't catch that, it's Border Services as well as CFIA. Okay, I hate to end on a somewhat negative note, so 30 seconds to 1 minute from each of you. Just when you look at where Canadian beef is at, what gives you the most optimism? What are you most excited about the next 5 years? Who wants to go first? We could do reverse order.
Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to say the CRSB certification mark and that ability to, again, shine that Canadian brand through that and build that consumer trust. And I think, again, like I said, that's going to be both domestically and internationally, just raising the quality perception of Canadian beef even more.
I guess maybe as Canadians we have to permit ourselves to be a bit optimistic from time to time. You know, it's overtime and we're going to win. I think a lot of the basics are in place, and if you look at Alberta, I realize there may be those from other parts of the country here, but you know, 70% of the cattle on feed are in Alberta. We have 40% of the herd here. We have the infrastructure, the climate, and the plants, the proximity to the U.S. market for live cattle and beef, as well as the day's travel to the coast. You know, that is a strategic natural advantage that was given to us through the climate, the soils, the topography we have here, and the ingenuity, the genetics, and the genomics that are happening. You know, I'm very positive.
When we look at the first quarter of 2019 compared to the first quarter of 2018, our exports are up, just about 40% in value, and I think that that's really speaking to the momentum that's been building over the last number of years, whether that's access into Korea, into the CPTPP markets, into the European market, and the stability that we've maintained within the North American market. I think it is sending some pretty strong signals that the world really likes Canadian beef, and they're willing to pay a top dollar for it. And so I think that the Canadian government recognizes that Canadian agriculture has more potential to add to the Canadian economy, and so there's steps in place to help drive that forward. So hopefully, things keep on chugging forward, and we get some really great years ahead of us in terms of Canadian beef.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for their time today. If there was a question that you didn't get a chance to answer, they will be sticking around and they're available to answer one-on-one questions if there's something you didn't want to speak up. So thank you all very much for sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.